and the color was synonymous with royalty. Um, let's see, so Sidon, known locally as Saida or Saida in Arabic, is the third largest, so today is the third largest city in Lebanon. So unlike Nineveh before, who was completely taken off the map to where armies marched over the ruins and had no idea they were there. And then you have Sodom and Gomorrah, who were also obliterated. The neat thing with Sidon and Tyre is that they are still in existence. They have survived, for the most part, history. So in the modern era, it is Sidon is the third largest city in Lebanon. Has a population of roughly 80,000 within its city limits and more of 250,000 within its metropolitan areas. It was known by its Greek name at the time, Phonikos, which gave the land its name. Yeah, sorry on that pronunciation. So for all of Lebanon's cities, Sidon's the most mysterious. Isn't that like a donut offense? It would be at work. And we usually require good donuts, like...
I got a new phone, so I don't know how to turn off the notification.
So for all of Lebanon's cities, this Sidon's the most mysterious, for its past has been tragically scattered and plundered. So in the 19th century, treasure hunters and archaeologists made off with many of its important objects, some of which can be seen in museums. And even within the 20th century, a lot of ancient objects from Sidon has turned up in the antiquities market. So as we dig beneath the concrete construction, we see that elements of its history still survive. So we believe that it was inhabited as early as 4000 BC, and the author Homer in the 8th century notes that the skill of the Sidonians in producing glass production made Sidon both rich and famous. And the city was also known for being very cosmopolitan and progressive. The princess Jezebel, who would later become Queen of Israel, as related in Kings 1 and 2, was the daughter of the king of Sidon, Ethbal, in the 9th century, and married King Ahab of Israel to cement ties between the two kingdoms. The city is mentioned a number of times throughout Scripture by both Messiah and Paul, both Messiah and Paul have reported to have made visits there. It is Sidon's considered the seat of the Phoenician civilization, in that most of the ships that would sail the seas and spread Phoenician culture were launched from the city's ports. Sidon was overthrown during the conquest of Phoenicia by Alexander the Great in 332 BC, and like the rest of the fractured Phoenician civilization, was eventually absorbed by Rome and finally taken by Arab Muslims in the 7th century. So being a port city, we know that they grew in wealth through their maritime trade. They're known for their skill in shipbuilding and navigating. Okay, it's not in my notes, but I read a book titled Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, and they mention the Phoenicians at length, detailing how some of the most ancient world maps still in existence came from these guys. That's not in my notes. There you go.
They had really cool boats. They painted like the cool eyes on all of their ships, right?
I believe so.
I thought those were Greeks.
Well, the Greeks might have adopted it from them. Who knows? The historian Richard Miles writes, as early as the 3rd millennium, sailors from the Phoenician city of Byblos had developed ships whose curved hulls were able to meet the challenges of the sea, and were using those craft to deliver cargoes of cedar wood to Egypt. And over the following centuries, Byblos and other Phoenician states such as Sidon, Tyre, Arvad, and Beirut created an important niche for themselves by transporting luxury goods and bulk raw materials from overseas markets back to the Near East. So the popularity of the Phoenician trade is attested to by artifacts manufactured at Sidon and have been found ranging from Egypt throughout Mesopotamia to Rome and Britain. The Phoenicians have been referred to as the middlemen of culture due to the culture transfer which accompanied their trade. We know that the goods of Sidon in particular were highly prized, and the Egyptians are thought to have learned their skill in manufacture from, why did I not look at that word? Oh well. So I guess the Egyptians learned a skill from the Sidonians. Their skill with glass making is so impressive that it's actually believed that it originated with them. As mentioned, they manufactured dye, especially purple dye, made from the murex shellfish. They produced cloth, which was so expensive that only nobility could afford to purchase it, and this, of course, contributed greatly to their wealth. This dye is what gave the Phoenicians their Greek name, which means the purple people. It's Phoinkes, the purple people. Although that term would come to commonly be associated with the city of Tyre, its manufacture was originally at Sidon. Richard Miles states that the products for which the Phoenician cities would become most renowned and luxuriously embroidered garments, cloth dyed in deepest purple. Their quality would be recognized in ancient literature from the Bible to Homer's Odyssey. The dye was obtained from the hypobranchial glands of two species of mollusks that proliferated in the region. Installations for the production of the dye have been found by archaeologists in a number of Phoenician towns, although the stench that emanated from the rotting mollusks was so overpowering that the dye factories were located at the edge of town. Production was often on a large scale, and the mound of discarded mirrored shells at Sidon measured over 131 feet high. So that's how much they went through in their production. We know that as a Phoenician city, like I said, they didn't share as one government for all of them. They all had their own governments, so they sometimes worked together, and other times they rivaled each other. So the city flourished as part of a loose confederation of city-states spread along the coast of the land of Canaan. Although they shared a common linguistic, cultural, and religious inheritance, the region was very rarely politically united, with each city operating as a sovereign state ruled over by a king or local dynasty. This brought Sidon into competition with other states of Phoenicia for trade, and especially with the city of Tyre. In the 10th century BC, the balance of power shifted to Tyre primarily due to the leadership of the city's kings. Abibal, and after him his son Hiram. Tyre forged trade agreements with the newly minted kingdoms of Israel and Judah and their king David. This agreement made Tyre wealthy, and Sidon, trying to compete, entered into their own pacts with the kingdom of Israel, including the marriage of the Sidonian princess Jezebel, previously mentioned, to King Ahab of Israel. We see that Jezebel's insistence on maintaining her own religion and personal identity was an affront to a number of Ahab's subjects, and most notably, the prophet Elijah, who denounced her. Jezebel and Ahab's rule was ended by a coup by the general Jehu, and with it, Sidonian trade agreements with Israel. At the end of the Persian era, in 351 BC, unable to resist the superior forces of Artaxerxes III, the desperate Sidonians locked their gates and set their city on fire rather than submitting to these invaders. They estimate that more than 40,000 Sidonians died in that event. After this, the city was so devastated, or was too weak to oppose the triumphal march of Alexander the Great in 332 BC. It sued for peace, and the Hellenistic age of Sidon begins. So we know that they were conquered by a number of nations, along with the rest of Phoenicia, including the Syrians, the Persians, and finally by Alexander from Macedonia. So having heard of Alexander's exploits and his campaign to topple Darius III of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the Sidonians surrendered to him without even a fight. The historian Worthington writes, the people in Sidon even went as far as deposing their own king, Straton II, because he was Darius's friend. Sidon's efforts to placate Alexander were not mirrored by Tyre, however, who resisted the conqueror that same year and was finally sacked, its inhabitants slaughtered, and the survivors sold into slavery. Following Alexander's death, Sidon and the rest of the Phoenician world fell under the rule of one of his generals and successors, Seleucus I Nicator. That was circa 305 to 281 BC, founder of the Seleucid dynasty. The region of Phoenicia, including Sidon, became increasingly Hellenized during Seleucid I's reign, and remained so even after 64 BC, when the Roman general Pompey annexed the region to the Roman Empire. When the empire divided, Sidon became part of the eastern half, which eventually became the Byzantine Empire. Earthquakes and other natural disasters, as well as plagues, decimated the region between 395 and the current era, or AD, and the 7th century AD, when the city was finally taken over by Muslim Arabs. But under the successors of Alexander, Sidon, the holy city of Phoenicia, enjoyed relative freedom, organized games, competitions, and included some of the greatest athletes in that region. Sidon, like other cities, like I said, fell under Rome's dominion. It continued to mint its own silver coins. The Romans built a theater and other major monuments in the city. During the Byzantine period, when the great earthquake of 551 AD destroyed most of the city of Phoenicia, Beirut's school of law took refuge in Sidon. The town continued quietly for the next century until it was conquered by Muslims in 636 AD. In 1111 AD, Sidon was besieged and stormed by the Christian crusader Baldwin, who was soon to become king of Jerusalem. We get a glimpse of King Baldwin. This part's not in my notes, it just occurred to me. But we get a glimpse of King Baldwin and the rule of Jerusalem from the movie Kingdom of Heaven with Orlando Bloom. So under Christian rule, the city became the chief town and the second of the four barons of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem surrendered to Saladin in 1187 and was reoccupied for 100 years when it was recaptured briefly, but eventually abandoned for good in 1291 after the fall of Acre to Muslim forces. In the 15th century, Sidon was one of the ports of Damascus, and it flourished once again during the 17th century when it was rebuilt by Fakhreddin II, the ruler of Lebanon. And under his protection and encouragement, French merchants set up profitable enterprises in Sidon for trade between France and Syria. And then by the beginning of the 19th century, Sidon became relatively obscure and remained so until the mid-20th century, when it developed into an important commercial and agricultural center. So an interesting note on this is that although the dates of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey are still in dispute, only Sidon and Sidonians are mentioned 17 times between both the Iliad and Odyssey. But it's interesting that there's failure to mention Tyre, as well, some speculate that maybe Tyre wasn't as important during the time of the writing, but most of Homer's usage appears to relate the term Sidonian with Phoenicians in general. But during the 2nd century BC, Sidon was the preeminent port city until the 1st century when Tyre eclipsed them. So that's what I have on Sidon. So I guess I can start talking on Tyre until we start our worship. I'll just have to reach a good breaking point. So some of the high points of Tyre's history, their religion is reasonably well understood. Yes, ma'am?
Distance-wise, how far apart are these cities?
I think I figured, I don't know if I put that.
It's not very far. You can see
Yeah, I didn't think they were very far.
they're just both coastal cities.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have that in here. I forgot to put it. Well, I forgot to mention that the origin of the Phoenicians, also, they were Canaanites. And we learn that from Genesis 10, verses 15 through 19, which shows the sons of Canaan founding several of those cities. So unlike Sidon, where very little of Sidon's religion remains, Tyre, we actually understand quite a bit about them. So their religion is reasonably well understood. As mentioned, the notorious Jezebel was the daughter of the 7th king of Tyre after Hiram, and a priest of Ashtar, also known as Aphrodite in Greek. So Jezebel took with her to Israel a retinue of her priest, for whom Ahab was inclined to build on the hill of Samaria. That's detailed in 1 Kings 16:32. A temple to the Tyrian god Baal, also identified as Melkarth and Adonis. So culturally, the Phoenicians were Canaanites and spoke a variation of the Canaanite language, worshipped a variation of the same gods as the Canaanite people in Israel. The fertility god, commonly referred to as Baal in the Bible, was commonly worshipped in Phoenicia, along with the attendant practice of ritualized prostitution, sex worship, and infant sacrifice. The particular Baal deity worshipped in Tyre was named Melkart or Melquart, Q or K depending on how they want to spell it. I came across both variations. So it's Melkart or Melqart. So the Greeks saw Melkart as a variation of their own demigod Hercules, or Heracles to the Romans. This connection to the Greek divine hero would play a role in the city's downfall. The Tyrian, oh, nice.
Jeff has a map with estimates on mileage, and it looks like 25 miles-ish.
In between each one.
That's really close.
Yeah.
Close as Silverdale?
Couple hours.
25 to 25 miles?
Further.
I'd say like Kingston to Silverdale.
Yeah.
Yeah, and with
On the coast,
probably
you
a
just-
good chunk of that travel being taken up by boat.
They've got some cool looking ships.
So the Tyrian Baal worship of Melkart seems to have been introduced into the 10 tribe kingdom of Israel during the reign of King Ahab. We know that Ahab unwisely made a marriage alliance with Jezebel. Yet the name Ethbal means with ball. We know that the daughter of that king was Jezebel. So it seems prior to this point that Tyre and the people of Judah kind of soured once that religion was introduced into Israel. The prophet Joel accused the people of Tyre and Sidon of selling the people of Judah into slavery to the Greeks. This is given in Joel 3:6, where he says, "And the people of Judah and Jerusalem you have sold to the Greeks in order to remove them. And the people of Judah and you have been sold to the Greeks in order to remove them far from their territory." So a study of this cult can leave us kind of nauseated and depressed. As stated, they did practice child sacrifice. But it does explain to us why Ezekiel was led to predict their utter destruction as being the nerve center of Baal worship. So we know that Tyre was one of the most important cities in the ancient Near East, and it was built on an island in the eastern Mediterranean. It controlled 2 natural harbors. You don't have the map up there. So Tyre itself, the new city, is on a small island just right off the mainland. So it was sufficiently close to the shore to be supplied from its mainland, but sufficiently far enough to be nearly impossible to capture. It was larger than the area that is now occupied by the old city. Parts had been swallowed by the sea. The ancient city also controlled a fertile coastal strip, some 2 kilometers wide, with minor towns, sanctuaries, and farms. On the shores of the village of shell collectors, in the east was an occupied hill named Al-Mashuk, and near Al-Rashideh in the south was an old town, probably identical to Usu mentioned in the Assyrian texts, and Palaitiros, Old Tyre, from the Greek sources. This was, according to Arrian, the site of a very ancient sanctuary of Heracles, and archaeologists have found several Bronze Age tombs within that region. So there's 2 sources they have near Usu, one at Al-Rashideh itself, and the other bit further south at Ras El Ain, which the definition is head of the source. And the third source was at Al-Bakbog, north of Tyre. So these were, I guess, water sources. Yeah, rich in water.
So it's an island?
Tyre itself is an island. So you have Old Tyre and New Tyre, I guess is how they now recognize it.
So are they connected?
They are now.
So is the dam like a strip of road?
Well, later in my lesson, we're going to see with Alexander's siege, Alexander the Great, that he built an artificial causeway to reach the island.
In roughly 332 BCE.
Yeah, and then it left. The causeway was left there, and then over time, sediment and stuff built up and essentially connected the two naturally. So later on in my notes, we're going to find that Alexander was so thorough and determined that his conquest of Tyre would alter the very geography of the island. At this point, it's separate from the mainland, but Alexander the Great would change that. All because they had to insult him. So don't go insulting conquerors. So the Bronze Age that we attribute to the mid-5th century BC, the Greek researcher Herodotus visited Tyre and learned from a priest there that the town and the temple of Melkart were at the time believed to be 2,300 years old. So in other words, the city itself was founded in the 28th century, more or less confirmed by archaeological evidence at the Al-Mashuk Hill, which are even older. And then in the second millennium, Tyre is mentioned several times in the Amarna letters. For example, King Abenmilki asks Egyptian support in conflict with Sidon. The shrine of the goddess Asherah in Tyre is mentioned in the Epic of King Keret, which is known from Ugarit. Letters from the same town show that the inhabitants were interested in Tyrian textiles. And no,
Is it Mesopotamia?
yeah,
We learned about that, guys. Sorry.
well, some of the oldest civilizations stem from Mesopotamia.
I wish Jude and Alice were here. They were having a lot of fun learning about ancient civilizations.
So no doubt purple played a role because it was a product that Tyre was well known for. We see that Tyre is mentioned in a list of places from the reign of the Egyptian king Seti I from 1293 to 1279 BC, while a stela has been found in Tyre that commemorates a victory by Seti's son and successor, Ramses II, given in 1279 to 1213 BC. The region was barely touched during the crisis that is commonly associated with the arrival of the Sea People, making the Phoenician cities full of confidence. And this is illustrated by the story of when Amun, the ill-fated Egyptian diplomat who at the end of the 12th century was sent out to buy lumber in Byblos, and he mentions Tyre in passing. Then we get to the time of King Hiram at the beginning of the Iron Age. This is when Tyre replaces Sidon as the most important city in the region. Tyre is mentioned as founder of the Kition on Copper Island of Cyprus, of Carthage, Utica and Lixus, and of Gades in Andalusia. And I'm sorry, pronunciation of some of these cities. I'm sure it sounds better in their tongue. The Roman author Pliny the Elder mentions Tyre as the mother town of Lepsis Magna, but that's probably a mistake, according to some historians. Modern historians often refer to the Tyrian kings Abibal and Hiram, who probably lived in the 10th century BC, but they're concerned with, I guess concern is a bad word, but the historians, their issue with Abibal and Hiram is that they're only mentioned in Scripture. I guess so far they haven't found any actual historical evidence that they existed. But they're mentioned prominently in Samuel and Kings. The general impression is that Hiram had good relations with King David and King Solomon, helping to build Jerusalem's temple and palaces, and contributed to naval expeditions. So we can see that at this point, the city-state of Tyre enjoyed good relations with Israel and Judah, although their relationship was more commercial and not really based on religion or cultural sympathy. When King Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem, King Hiram of Tyre famously supplied cedar from the forests of Lebanon, as well as other materials, even skilled workmen. From this, Hiram was well paid. This is illustrated in 1 Kings chapter 5. One export that contributed to the great wealth of Tyre was purple, which became known as Tyrian purple. This was the most precious dye of its time, in large part because of the great amount of labor required to produce even a small amount. So first, Murex shellfish from the Mediterranean were captured in traps in large numbers, and then they took an incredible amount of these shellfish to produce a single grain or a single gram of dye. They said, for example, as many as 12,000 shellfish were used to produce the dye for a single garment. For this reason, owning garments dyed purple was prohibitively expensive for most people, and in time became, like I said, associated with royalty. When do we normally do the worship? Should we stop now? Okay. Okay, let me finish up this section, and then we can stop. So the people of Tyre, along with the neighboring city of Sidon, are generally called Phoenician. Like I said, they didn't share one government for all of them, so Phoenician is more of a general term. Principal cities, already mentioned, were Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre, but they established colonies all along the North African coast and as far west as Portugal and Spain. The cities of Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre are located within territory of modern-day Syria and Lebanon. A Phoenician colony in northern Africa called Carthage later becomes a major city and becomes a fierce competitor with the Republic of Rome. So they were seafaring people, and their merchant ships ventured all over the Mediterranean, making their cities very wealthy. And yeah, they went as far west as Spain. Okay, so we can stop there, and then I'll pick up again after our break and worship and all that. Someone care to close us?
That's current day. Tyre.
Yeah. Can you scroll back up?
This is ancient, so that over time they built that
Yeah.
bridge up.
I wonder, if earthquakes are endemic to that region, what a really solid one would do.
Maybe more due to like a tsunami than an actual earthquake.
You think? If that's all sand, I mean, sand's not the most stable.
I'm sure they put some kind of stone face or. I'd have more confidence in this than I would in Seattle.
Yeah.
So, okay, I'll just consider this to be a stopping point right here, and then we can stop, do our worship, and then I'll come back and pick up. Somebody care to close us? Brother Justin, perhaps?
Sure. Father God, thank you for gathering us together today. I pray that you give us an attitude of worship and praise. Thank you for the lessons that Ryan's been presenting, some historical knowledge on some of the ancient cities, Lord. Pray that you would be with those who are at home, that they would heal, that you would be with the body